we start to think about, start to step into. When we came to the church, having had my father involved in the church and his aspirations, we thought the church was much further along than it was. So when we went into training at Sandy Soto, we did some other training at different places. It seemed very much rooted in the Christian tradition and not enough in our Indigenous tradition. So looking at the parallels, looking at the understandings, what we heard growing up was a very different message. Coming from the reserve, coming from our community, we had scholars and theologians come there to share their thinking, and some of their thinking really impacted the future generations, because they wanted to bring back our traditional way of worship, our traditional way of ceremony, our traditional way of doing things, and to stop demonizing our relatives who were practicing their traditional way of life, who were doing the sweat lodge, who were doing their pipe ceremonies, who were doing smudging. And so to alleviate that, all of these people came together to talk about or take apart what they believed and how they shared belief on certain things. Here we think about elders who said, as Indigenous people, we were obedient to God. We didn't betray God. What they said was, we didn't eat the apple. And so by saying that, they're saying we have a different understanding. Our devotion to God, as expressed in our worldview and in our practice with the ways that we do our ceremonies, we do our observances of our cultural times, the Sundance and other times. We have during this time of the fall, more of the memorials. We have a tradition of taking our offerings to the loved ones who are departed, to the grave sites. We fix up the grave sites, we leave a plate of food, we do these types of things out of a tradition of how we are respecting our ancestors, and that thin veil of the ancestors' role in our community, because we still speak to them. We believe we still have contact with the spirit world. We still have contact with those that have different presences. So we get messages and things, signs of hope, signs of love that come from the other side. And so we think about that in this time. In the winter time, it's often a time of storytelling, sitting around the fire in the teepee, and you can't go outside, and there's blizzards going on, you can't do anything. You settle down and you listen to your elders, you learn from those around you. And it is this sense of trust in what they're telling you, this sense of love that they're imparting a knowledge to you. There's a deep want and need for that connection. And when we do that, we are lifting up what our ancestors have done. We try to live in that space of being faithful to what they have taught us and what we learn from the world around us, what we learn from the Christian. Here, in this example, with Advent, there's a long history of Advent in the Christian church. There's particular ways that has been practiced in Catholic communities and more later in Protestant, and in my case, the United Church and others, Anglican Church and others, that have taken this practice into remembrance of Christ in our world. So what I explained in the sermon this morning is that the Advent idea of Advent and the practice of Advent came around in 380 AD. And so it has been throughout that time that we have learned to incorporate this into this time of year. It was created to kind of settle people into Christ's message and to allow us to learn from this experience. So when we come into this space, we start to think about what Christ's coming means in the traditions of various faiths. They look at the word Advent means coming. And so this time is a time of taking stock of where we are and the emergence of a new thing. The Christ coming into the world is a new salvation, a new way of being. And so as we come up to this time, we're meeting that in our poverty, really, in our lack. And so when we think about what the tradition has said, this is the time of apocalyptic literature, a time of think about the end of the world and to think about this change and shift that Christ will be the catalyst for a new beginning, a new creation, a new life. And so when we think about what the timing of Advent tells us, it gives us a scope of we are not in a perfect world and that we are struggling to live out the message of our responsibility to God, our responsibility to Christ, and how that is a foundation that we can build on. So when we think about this time, there was a book written by Stephen Charleston, was just released this year, and it was called, I remember the name of the title, We Know the End of the World, or it was called, it's about the indigenous experience on this land of encountering apocalypse, an apocalypse through genocide, through loss, through displacement, through alienation, through discrimination. All of these things define how we are in this space. And a reminder of that things were not always perfect, but we have ways of overcoming them. So he talks a bit about the Hopi tradition in Arizona, the canyons in the mesas, and how in their tradition they talk about 5 different worlds that we've been through. And that means that we have gone through destruction into a lack or into a darkness and come out of that into the next world. And that may be a figurative world, that may be some of our experience of this fantastical ideas around stepping into different worlds. So there's a different way of thinking about where we are emerging from. And when we think about this in terms of cycles, for the liturgical calendar for Christianity, we are continually emerging from darkness. We are continually brought into the light by God. God continually creates the space for us. The altar, the tabernacle in Exodus and other ways that God is trying to reach out to us. And God is trying to inform us about what a practice in the land looks like, what a practice in the material world looks like for that veneration of knowing who we are, where we belong. All of these things come into play when we start to think about the this aspect of Advent that seeks to acknowledge we need to stop We need to pause. We need to begin to assess where we've been in order to receive this gift of Christ and of the message of a new hope in the way that it has been brought to us. Oftentimes, when we think about these works, we think about creation in Genesis 1, where God creates the world. God spoke into the world and created, so let there be light. And so the world was the universe was created. And in doing this, there's a benevolence from God. There's a continual entrance of God to enact these things that are happening. So Genesis, we see that when God, we were asked in a Canadian Bible Society training, where is the first instance of mercy? Where is the first instance of God reconciling? And for me, when I look at Genesis 2, verse 18, where he notices that Adam is lonely, there's an act of recognizing an issue or a problem and then doing something to address that. And so there's this care and concern that's coming from God. And in the Bible, we see this over and over again, where God is the actor of this benevolence. God is the actor of this care and concern. We don't necessarily always do that for each other. We think about the story of Cain and Abel. We don't necessarily follow in that practice. And so to rehabilitate ourselves, to bring back our God-given nature, we go through these trials, these ceremonies, these ways of being, to bring ourselves into right relationship with God, and also later in the New Testament, Christ. So here we have a way of thinking about how we are involved with this act of reconciliation, this act of healing, this act of doing good works for one another and to help one another. In our tradition, we have what's called the giveaway, which is a ceremony where the headman or the chief would give away 90% of their belongings. And in doing that, they would secure with the people the responsibility to care for one another by saying, this is not about what I can accumulate, it's about what I can give back to the community and to do for you to do likewise. In a community where everybody just takes, which is kind of what we see in some communities, that doesn't work because there's no reciprocity, there's no social contract to do that, to do this work of giving back. And that's why it's important now in this time of Christmas, in this time of thinking about these gifts that we will receive, that we are also giving back, that we are also helping to support, that we are putting our resources and our efforts into things that are life-giving, things that are community building, things that are helping us to move into that next phase. So when I think about the cycle of Advent, we have hope, peace, joy, and love as these four tenets. And they're not the cardinal virtues. They are other efforts to define ways that we are together, or aspirations, I call them. But when we look at how we are and how we act during this time, it's not necessarily guided by those pillars. We try, but those are like when we see the idea of Christ being Son of Man and Messiah and the one outside of our experience who takes our sins away, that removes the agency of us, that we need to do something, that we need to act in particular ways where we need to respond to that gift. And I think that that is a really critical part of how we are developing understanding. So when we think about these pillars that we have in our, and this is I always put it in the direction of the four directions. So we have in the beginning a yellow candle that is
Wogirayami, which is this idea of courage at the beginning to take that step, to start to become. Then in our tradition, we have Igichichubi, which is that lesson of generosity, that lesson of giving back and of sharing, and that responsibility to not just be in isolation, but to be community minded, to be integrated in a way of thinking that is healthy for all. In this cycle, we think about Wijan Chinyabi, which is this call for fortitude or strength or resilience through these cycles to try to maintain our sense of integrity and our sense of being. And so that last candle, which is for wisdom, Haram Winchoharge Mikagia, is this call and response of our elders, our ancestors. It is a way to say that it's not just random wisdom that we are living out, but it is the call of our ancestors and the values that they were putting forward, what we learn from them and what we continue to venerate in these practices, so that as we gather in this cycle, we can think about the ways in which what the trials that we are put through and the ways that we respond bring us to this point of wisdom. And so very much so, it's almost a commonsensical sort of thing, but it's not what we practice during Advent. It is the aspirational, let's all be good. Let's all be good children so that we'll get our presents kind of thing. But it's not this idea of, as we are being good, we are doing good to others and we are living in that space. When we think about the current climate of the struggles that people have with in Gaza and other places, there is a need to recognize there will be times where these are tested, these lessons are tested. So if we test hope, peace, joy, and love, what are our repercussions? What do we gain from that? As we test our virtues around generosity, around fortitude, around wisdom, and around the courage, what do we gain? What do we learn from these pillars that can give us the tools that we need for the future? When we think about these teachings, and when I talk about these teachings, it is in reference to our treaty relationship, because the treaty is the foundation of how we are in this land and how we gain a sense of belonging and a sense of discrete community within this community, this society. It doesn't always translate. So the work that we try to do is to bridge the communities, give instruction to others around how we are trying to promote peace, promote love, promote joy, promote hope through our action. And so to me, the two practices complement one another. They give strength to one another. This sense of self and this sense of duty, this sense of high-minded and I think really beautiful understandings require us to achieve that in our own life by confronting and understanding where we are coming from and why. So here in this space, we think about the connections of these teachings to that centeredness. We bring this in a season of light. So I was at the menorah lighting in City Hall on Monday, and that season of light, that gesture towards illumination and empowerment and working toward our better selves is a foundation that all communities are starting to build on. We had the Diwali celebrations, which are also a festival of light. We have in Ramadan the other ways in which we step into our beliefs in a strong way. And here in Christianity, we have Advent. So there are ways that we are called to produce or to work toward this light and this illumination. In our indigenous tradition for the Sioux people, the blanket here is a star blanket. The star blanket represents that morning star that enters into the world and shines the first light of day into this darkness. And that to us is a symbol of Christ. It is a symbol of God's blessing to have another day. And that's why at that point, our elders do a smudge and remember that God is a loving God. God is one who provides. God is one who has set us in this place for a purpose. And so as we work through that, and as we find these questions of our purpose, it is this central way, especially through our vision quest, through our pipe ceremony, through our smudge, and our prayers, that we start to define what that means for not just ourselves and our function, but for the community that receives us and the community that welcomes us back in. After the vision quest, the youth who takes that on, they would prepare for a number of months or years to do that. They would go on their vision quest if they had a vision. It's not always guaranteed that they'll have a vision. When they come out of that, they have earned something new, and that medicine man, medicine woman will name them, rename them, name them with their adult name. So they are given a new name. They're given a new identity. And with that identity comes a purpose and a call to do particular work. If they're called to be a great hunter, if they're called to be a gatherer, medicinal person, herbalist, and all these type of things, or a leader, a warrior, all of these things they do for the community. All of these things, they are named and then accepted into the community with their new name, with their new identity. And so in doing that, we take time to remember that each of us are placed into that supporting role for our communities. Each of us have found some way of working through that. We may not have had the ceremony. We may not have been called in that way, but there is a calling to us around why we gather in these places, why we want to learn, what we are looking for, and what helps us to move through each day in healing, in recovery, in reconciliation. And so for those things, we give thanks with our blessing to one another. So I'm going to light this smudge, take it around to the group here. This is a gathering of our medicinal plants and herbs from the mountains that we share in our Sundance, and it is a way that we commune with God, because in the rising of the smoke, it takes our prayers to the Creator. We use the smudge as a purification for our bodies, mind, for our spirit, and in these things we give thanks for the life that we have been given, the purposes that we have been called to, and the work that we are set, that has been set before us. Take this around and remember that there's no right or wrong way to smudge. This is something that is different for various tribes. Some don't use this, some use other ways, brushings, and other ways of healing for one another. But we give thanks for at least our teaching and for sharing that. Okay. I forgot to say that it's not always, when we offer a smudge, it's not, we don't expect everybody to have to do it. Especially coming out of the residential school system and assimilation, oftentimes these have been demonized. These have been misinterpreted or maligned in some way. And these practices, because of the way that we came back to them, because of the way they have been taken and hidden, they have been something of an offering back to the community as we remember where we have been in our traditions, what our traditions mean, and learn the meaning of them. That doesn't mean that we impose them on anyone. That means that we always allow for those experiences of those, even our own people may not want to do that. That's fine. We continue on our process. And this is part of what reconciliation means, because it's not about all coming into one view, one understanding. It's also about sharing and learning from one another, that we can find a space where we can take that information that we've been given and apply it in new ways into our own practice, into our own will. So it's a way of branching out and giving ourselves a sense of new understanding, so that we're not saddled to only one form of thinking. We can grow as we learn and take that information and utilize it in ways that make sense for us now, that may change over time, may become something different. When I think about what some of the practices are doing, so there's a group called Wild Church, and they were going to take some tobacco out, and it's a bunch of non-native people, they wanted to put tobacco down on the ground. And I said, well, is that really your tradition? What would it look like if you used your own tradition? If you knew some of your, say, Celtic background or some other type of background, the types of plants and herbs that you venerate, the ones that you understand, the ones from your land that you can work with. It's a different experience. Or if you don't have that, what is meaningful to you? So jokingly, I said, well, you could take a $50 bill and put it under the tree. That signifies what is meaningful to you, what sacrifice means to you, and give you a better understanding of what we are trying to do when we put tobacco down. And so it doesn't have to be that. I mean, putting a $50 bill down sounds comical, but you could put that $50 into a wildlife preservation fund, put that $50 into a protection of the wilderness area in the city. So there are other ways that we can start to think about that. But we won't get there until we start to take these teachings and apply them in ways that are meaningful for us. So we can't just mimic people and do the colonial thing of taking from here and there and trying to formulate something new. We need to work with what we've been given and see what the world is trying to tell us through these engagements, through these personal relationships, through these texts and learnings from various sources. So when we think about that, how can we be good stewards of the information that we are getting? So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to ask, maybe go around the room. You can either answer the question, or you can just maybe talk about what one thing stood out for you or what you are thinking about now. It doesn't have to be anything profound, just kind of share what's in your heart. But if you want to answer the question, it goes back to, how do we do this work of reconciliation? How are we living into that? How are we acting that out? How is this being applied in the lessons and in the teachings that we do? Another big long question, but go for it.
Well, I was thinking when you were talking about in the struggle, then Jesus came on the scene, and the groups were small. The teachings were in small groups because they were up against a huge backlash in terms of the Jewish community and not accepting them, and that they did it very much like this, and very much in small places, and then talked with other people, and then it grew, and so it seems to me that all groups that have changed trying for the better, or trying to do cultural beliefs, it starts small. It can't be a hammer thing, but understanding, sharing, being with one another, and really hearing it in a calm, peaceful environment to truly understand it. So just to cross that road a little bit, thinking, initial groups did it this way because the bigger community was against that. So I think of reconciliation. I think it's important that how it's happening is a really important process to sit with people and experience some of the teachings in a quiet way, and have time to hear.
Yeah. There's a couple of things that came across my mind. Yeah, yes, this time of year, especially in December, is also a time of grieving for us, our people. And, in the rest of the year, it's not polite for us to talk about people who have passed. But in the month of December is a month of grieving. It's a month of celebration, really, but this is a time that we can also do some grieving, talking about our loved ones. In the month of December, we talk about our loved ones, the ones that have passed. And it's okay, because now the spirits are like the rest of nature. They're asleep. The trees are asleep. Everything's kind of like. So now the spirit is also, it's like in dormant. So now it's okay for us to talk about these, our loved ones. And that's why I say it's also mourning, and grieving, but also a good time to remember our loved ones. So those are the things that I wanted to say, you mentioned, and those are the things that I wanted to bring up because they crossed my mind. And the other thing that crossed my mind is my daughter. My daughter once asked me, she got quiet and then she said, "Dad, did I do something wrong?" And I said, "Well, what did you do?" And she said, I went to a sweat. And I said, that's good. But I also went to church, she said. That's also good, I told her. I mean, what's wrong? And she said, did I do something wrong? And I said, no. The only person I can say that you did wrong is you. I mean, what you did is something that I do. Yes, I am Christian. I do go to church. I do pray. But that doesn't mean I've abandoned my culture, tradition. I'm very much Aboriginal, spiritual person. But I told her that you didn't do anything wrong, my girl. I mean, God is probably smiling down on you because of how you praised him. You went to churches, that's a beautiful thing. You went to a sweat, that's a beautiful thing. God is smiling down on you. You didn't do anything wrong. So that's the thing that I wanted to mention that, my daughter, she didn't do anything wrong. She's a beautiful, beautiful person. And because of that, you know, and I stress how my parents wanted me to be Christian. They sent me to church on Sunday. And yeah, I wanted to integrate. We do have to believe in something. And so, yeah, this is my choice, and I'll continue. Thank you for letting me share.
Yes.
I'm also grieving this month. I lost my brother when I was, I think, 6, and of course, you always ask for God. When you're 6 years old, you ask God for it. You know, hear your prayers and bring him back. He didn't bring him back. He didn't come back. I was not a Christian after that. I wasn't even in church. It wasn't until maybe 5, 6 years ago, maybe a little bit, that I started to really sort of come back into the church and sort of explore what had happened. The only one in my family that was ever really of any sort of religious was my grandmother. The rest of us and the rest of the family did not celebrate Christian. And then I read a book. You've been studying this book, and it asked you, what are you a Christian? How do you celebrate being a Christian? I had to really ask myself that. If I'm going to church, how am I going to be a Christian? What kind of a Christian do I want to be? And that took some real insight and some thought. And I've written down some stuff, searched it, researched it. And yeah, I'm still exploring that sort of a way. But I like the teachings in the Indigenous world. My great grandmother, we called her Granby, was an Indigenous. She was Cree, and she used to have some of these things around her house. I didn't fully understand it at that time because we didn't really talk about it. But she did have some of the symbols and some of the stuff around. And so I'm kind of trying to go back and explore some of that, and maybe ask some questions of what was important to them or important to her in her life. So it's been a journey, and I'm unfortunately getting a little too old to sort of hop around like I want to. But anyway, thank you.
My heart's thinking about peace and reconciliation. Tony, right away I thought about just how hard it is to be in good relationship with people sometimes. And so the courage, the generosity, what's the blue one again? Courage, generosity. Fortitude and wisdom. Just thinking about, you know, in all my communities, there's just broken relationships. This time of year, thinking about how Christ really came to restore relationships so that everyone could be in a good community. And those 4 things help me think about how to live in good community. But yeah, it's really good for me to think about how sometimes I don't bring my best to relationships and community. I want to, in my heart I want to, but it's just hard sometimes. Whether it's family, beyond. Thank you.
You said something at Hillhurst today that kind of struck a chord with me when you talked about different tribes of Indigenous people. I'm not sure, exchanging children and how one tribe looked at, or something about that.
Yeah.
I think about that in terms of, I was thinking about Israel and Palestine, right? And how it's gone past that into children, right?
Yeah.
But the wisdom between, because you're holding each other's future in your hands, so they're holding yours, and so there's a whole trust learning thing there, and there's a lot of wisdom in that. How it works in this world, I don't know, but it kind of struck a chord with me in church this morning. Then I was thinking about reconciliation, how I think reconciliation has to start within myself. Me with myself, me with my body, me with my God, me with other people, and kind of build out from there. Yeah, I spent a lot of my time worrying about self because I spent my youth feeling in danger in the world, right? So I was always self-centered because I'm trying to survive the world being different. And then you're talking about different traditions. I'm half Ukrainian, and I trace my ancestors back to the 1600s. And I don't even want to call it Ukraine because it wasn't Ukraine at that time. It's been a lot of different things. And like some of my ancestors weren't originally baptized Greek Orthodox or Ukrainian Orthodox, and they were actually pagan. They did pagan sun worshiping and all sorts of things. And a lot of the Ukrainian tradition comes from them bringing pagans and the pagan traditions into, like the coloring Easter eggs and all that kind of stuff actually comes similar to the indigenous traditions, right? Things that they developed on their own over time. So yeah, that kind of struck with me too. You know, to talk about the courage and I didn't know Advent meant the coming. So, and then the apocalypse, and we were just talking about it's going to be okay, right? Yeah, it's just, Thank you.
All of you contributed to my mind opening up more and more and more, so thank you. I would just speak to something personal around peace and recognizing that as I felt so focused on the world and wanting world peace, and my emotions just became so strong, but at the same time there was a breakdown within my family, my parents and siblings. That circle was very very devastating. And I decided to do a peace project. I'm an artist, so I started painting peace flags. And I painted one for everybody involved, even though they weren't necessarily talking. And as I painted it, I began to recognize how I could create inner peace. And then I began to realize that that's the only way for me at this point where I'm at is to contribute to peace, is to find it. And so then I painted one for my brother and so on. And I delivered it to my brother and I said, it's just a peace offering. Do with it as you will. I love you. I have to go because he was not kind. And it's just something that happened that has stood me well to go through that effort myself. And now as I see, globally, things becoming even more distressing to the point where I can hardly believe it or bear it. I just remember that I've got to dig in for my own, I got to get the peace in here first for it to serve anyway.
I think it's helpful. I just want to explain a little bit about that child story. In the Bear Hills, just south of Edmonton, that's a place where they enacted a peace between Nehiyaw Cree and the Tsitabi, the Blackfoot. So they put down arms against each other at that point. And what they did was they exchanged children so that they couldn't fight each other anymore because they're more integrated in their relationship. They're closer as kin. And so you can't fight your own kin. So that's one lesson. The other lesson we talked about was Cypress Hills, where it's a holy land for the Stoney, for the Assiniboine people, and that's where Sitting Bull came after the Battle of the Little Bighorn. He came to the Cypress Hills because that was a center of power, and that's a place where they would always have big sun dances and big ceremonies in that area. And even though it was one of our sacred and holy areas, the Blackfoot, who didn't know how to get along with the Assiniboine, with the Sioux, with the Stoney, would go there to do their ceremonies. And so rather than it turning into what we see in the Holy Land, they allowed for each other to do their ceremonies, and they moved on to other places. This is the same thing that happened with Shoshone and the Lakota. They have 7 sacred areas that they go to in a cycle, and they travel to those areas to do their ceremonies. And the Shoshone have a similar understanding of some of these are sacred to them, but then when they do their cycle, they always miss each other, so they're not in each other's spaces when they do that. And so there's this respect for other practices, other beliefs, other ways. And it's never, my father says, it was never about trying to tell people that what they were doing was wrong. It was never about trying to force people to conform to their own beliefs, to the beliefs of the person who's criticizing. It was always that an understanding that they're practicing the way that God told them to, and that's for them to live into, that's for them to do, and who are we to tell them not to? So this is the indigenous teaching versus the missionary sort of teaching of you have to learn Christian, otherwise you're all condemned and you're all going to hell, and everything is horrible. So that shift, and what my father says is, if they had learned to talk to one another, if they had learned to understand one another better, then they would have had a different outcome than trying to force the belief, especially on the children who couldn't defend themselves and ended up being killed, ended up being murdered or beaten into the graves that they found them in. So now we're living with this repercussion of an injustice as opposed to an illumination. So when we think about how these two worlds collide with different results, who are the more civilized? So we think about who treats one another as human beings, who helps one another, who shares and develops new tools for this. So that's 2 examples of the kind of forgiveness and reconciliation that we see in Indigenous practice. The other one is the story of the Great Tree of Peace. So the Haudenosaunee came together as a community of 5 different tribes who spoke different languages, had different customs, did different things. It reminds me of the EU, the European Union, where these 5 different groups came together to be one family, be one under one banner, and to try to give up their differences, to try to work together and to take on different roles. So the Mohawk are the guardians of the Eastern Door, and I think there's a Seneca that are guardians of the Western Door. So all of these things, they agree to work together, and they come together and formulate a way of peace, a way of working through issues of conflict and developing new tools for being in support of one another. But it came out of a vision. It came out of Deganawida, who was the peacemaker. And so he told them he had a vision where they all took their weapons and they buried them in the ground under a tree, and as the tree grew, all those weapons stayed there. So they would agree not to fight as long as that tree was alive and was keeping them from them. So there's a third way of seeing our tradition of peacemaking, our tradition of finding new ways through our spirituality, through visions, and through our practice of creating and being better to one another, finding ways to agree to be with one another. And the last way I'll talk about is the what's called the making of relatives. So in the Sioux tradition, we have something called the making of relatives. A lot of groups have ways of adoption to you adopt a grandmother, you adopt a grandfather, you adopt a cousin, you adopt a sister, brother. These adoptions, and that's kind of what you hear when they talk about Buffy St. Marie. But what the adoption was a way to bridge a family or a clan or a community. All the First Nations are generally interrelated, so they're all related in some way. And so those communities, rather than being closed communities that never talked to one another or never helped one another, this, in our tradition, the Sioux tradition, we had the making of relatives. And it was a way to take a conflict and take a bad feelings about one another and work through something that they would restore one another to wholeness and learn to move ahead in parallel existences. They weren't taking from one another, they weren't amalgamating, they weren't whitewashing all of the issues and the trauma, but they understood it. They did the ceremony to find a balance, a new balance. So it's really that idea of apology, and then what do you do after? How do you move forward? That's that act of reconciliation. So thinking about how in our traditions, we have these tools of how to be good reconcilers, and yet we don't hear from the Native people on these things. We hear treaties and legal ways of creating boundaries and doing all these things. We hear the interpersonal. That is the core of what Indigenous people are thinking and doing as they create these realities. So it's a different mindset, and I think that something we need to begin to heed. I'm trying to give you enough information so that you can maybe say something about what brings you here, or maybe what you've heard so far, just to share. This is one of the ministers here.
I'm very sorry I'm so late. My two children are actors, and they are auditioning for a play of C.S. Lewis.
Oh, wow.
And they said, Dad, you should. So with fear and trembling, I went to an audition with them. I had to read cold some Aslan, and it was very awkward. I was sweating. But I wanted to be with my children. So I knew this was happening. Lane had mentioned it this morning, and so I could be here just to be with you. But I'm late, and I'm just trying to understand the context well. So, Reverend, can you repeat how we're all sharing exactly what?
So the first half hour over here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Talking about the Advent season, talking about how this Indigenous interpretation kind of looks at it. A lot of the Advent time, you hear the four pillars of hope, peace, joy, and love. And to me, they're aspirational. They don't concretize into something of a personal directive. Yet, when I think about how we exist in the world, we have these pillars, which are the pillars of our community, in morally these teachings around courage, around generosity, fortitude, and wisdom. And how that can be more of a tool that informs how to achieve these goals that are so lofty that we assume are going to be benevolently given to us versus something that we see today we really have to work for and we have to be present for. The conflicts that happen in this city, the conflicts that happen overseas. How do we begin here by showing a better example of how to be a good, functional, healthy community through things like the treaty promise that says we will respect one another, we will try to work together where we can, but we will respect the autonomy of one another. And so that comes from the tradition of the elders talking about how this treaty is important because it sets the guidelines for how we are to be together. And yet we don't see that in the world around us. We see treaties being broken and so these legalistic writings that sort of preclude the error that will destroy them versus this is something of a way of life. It's a faith in one another. And to me, that's what is really that work of reconciliation, that we're doing this on good faith, that we're trying to build something from what we have learned of one another and what we've learned of our tradition, our faith tradition, our calling. That really becomes how we ground ourselves in this conversation, so that we can be here and active, not just here to throw bombs in and say, well, think about that, well, what about this? And I've seen that over and over again. It's like, how do we create a better situation, or something that is more meaningful when we gather?
There's two, for me, I often feel a little overwhelmed by, I'm not a government official. I don't belong to, I feel like one very small person in the cog of the environmental issues and reconciliation. So for me, it's a very individual kind of approach. Maybe that sounds egotistical. I don't mean it, but how am I responding to the people around me? From the clerk, your example of bringing a peace offering to your brother. It's just the two of you. You're not changing the world. It starts with, what's my posture to other people? Is it one that's humble? I think Lane and I are often in a position where we get to speak to others. How do we do that? Do we do it from our pulpit that we know, or are we cognizant of who each individual is and what they're thinking? And can we put our own agendas aside and really understand what the person is thinking and speak from that context? That seems like such a small thing, but so I liked your point. You're the point. I sort of only missed half. I only got half of yours, but you said I'm going to start with my own piece, and then from there mediate it. That's a good start. Part of my ego wants to influence a whole bunch of things, right? But who am I to? You look at the ballot, you look at the Middle East, and you look at Ukraine and Russia that you were alluding to. I feel like, what can I do except mourn? You know, and it's a helpless kind of feeling. That's maybe a very helpful thing to say.
So it is. I mean, think about where Indigenous people are at with some of the atrocities and things that have happened with our youth that are committing suicide or overdosing. They're living with that. And so we are, I always say that we're the canary in the coal mine. And the way that we work through these things is through our faith or spirituality, connection to them, trying to strengthen those bonds, that community, so that we don't have to go through this alone, that we're not sort of the only one in our heads. And I think that that's really important. That's, to me, it's all about that community mindedness. I was talking earlier about how God continuously reaches out to us, like in Genesis, creating the world, and then looking after Adam in Genesis 2, but then Exodus, when you have the building of the tabernacle, and these other examples of what that looks like when God is directing us and what we are doing with those teachings.
I don't think I just thought of something I could share that's a little bit more helpful.
Yeah.
This morning we read the story of, or last week, when Mary, in terms of the Advent, gets the news, the angel says, "You're going to get a son. He's going to become, and I know you're a virgin." And Mary is just kind of overwhelmed. And she doesn't know how to celebrate. She doesn't know who to share it with, because who's going to believe her? She can hardly believe it herself. And the angel does something really cool. He says to her, "Visit Elizabeth." And there's this priceless picture of Mary traveling all that distance. Doesn't want to tell anyone what the angel's told, because it's too freaky. But the moment she enters into the room with Mary, with Elizabeth, but both women, I think even John the Baptist jumps in the womb of Elizabeth, and there's this community that the two of them, I think God pushes people together to say, "You're not crazy. You have the same message. You are. I put you together because you need people with skin on." Because sometimes God is so far, he doesn't have skin on, and I can't. But then he gives me Elizabeth. And then we can hug and say, "It's true. I couldn't see." So the community aspect that you're alluding to is beautiful.
Can I just say something about what you said before? Don't need to take up too much time, sorry. I think you said something very profound, and I'm going to get tearful. I can feel it. We don't know how to mourn. We need teachers about how to mourn. Maybe we don't, there's so many things we don't quite know what to mourn about. And right now there's just a huge amount in the world. And so I think it's very helpful to, however you do that in your personal environment or in your position, to speak with people. I think as I hear people talking, they're having a hard time between anger and mourning, and aren't quite sure how to mourn and let the sadness out, let the grief out. So I thank you if that's what you're doing. That's a really important thing right now. There's a lot to mourn about. There's a lot to rejoice about. But I think
I don't know how to do it well. I like what you said between anger and mourning. I'm half the time I'm angry and half the time I need a good teacher to help me know how to mourn.
I think it's funny, that part about sending you somebody who's not going to think you're crazy. Our relationship, like,
Am I crazy? Tell me 3 things. Oh, no, you're not crazy.
I get, yeah. High River, Alberta will be underwater on June 26th. I wrote in July 2012, before the flood, and all sorts of stuff happened to me after I got into recovery, hit my bottom in addiction. And it does every day. It's like, and to have somebody who doesn't think you're crazy, right? And even going to church sometimes and sharing some things with, and then people at church looking at me like I'm crazy, and it's like the one place I thought should be saved, right? And it's not really completely safe, so
We can come to my house.
it's just like, we kind of go back and forth like that, and it's like, thank God, like, and all it takes is one. And all it takes is one, but, yeah.
And sometimes it's okay to be crazy for 3 hours. And then it passes. It's not an eternity of crazy. It's just that you just need to sit with a friend for those 3 hours. And the friend can say, "Do you want some tea?"
I was thinking too, I was looking at your shirt when you were lighting the Advent candles, Tony.
Yeah.
And I was thinking of those, the 4 directions and the guidance of that, and in Advent, we have the candles, and you put them in certain directions and stuff, and how those two came together for me, just the guidance through all of time with the 4 directions, and Advent, we celebrate that. We pull that.
It would be interesting if we could take those Advent themes and weave them into that in a way that shows us what we are seeking, how that it's not just these aspirations, it is a concrete practice we build in as we move through this gift of the Christ child into the Epiphany, into Lent, and how that comes.
Because we don't put Jesus away after Christmas.
Yeah,
We have the Advent.
no one puts Jesus in the corner. I'm gonna turn off the Zoom here. Thank everybody for jumping in. I think we still have 3 people left, but I'm going to let that go. Let's see what I missed on the chat. So thank everyone for coming, and I'm going to turn down the end the chat or end the session. Thank you.